It was a warm, sunny day when three siblings, Jack, Lily, and Ben, set sail from the small, picturesque harbor town on the edge of a vast ocean. Their parents waved them off, excited for what was supposed to be a thrilling adventure on the water. But they never came back. Just like that, the children vanished, swallowed up by the vast expanse of the sea. For 12 long years, their disappearance haunted the small town, tearing a family apart and leaving a mystery that seemed too strange, too deep to solve. Everyone thought they had drowned, maybe taken by the tides, or lost to some terrible storm. No one could have known that the truth was far darker, far more unsettling, than anyone could have imagined. What really happened that day? How did 3 children disappear without a trace, leaving no evidence behind? How did a father, devastated and broken by the loss, spend 12 years holding on to hope, until, one day, he discovered something that changed everything? This is not just another missing persons case. This is the kind of story that lingers, that stays with you long after you've finished watching. It's the kind of story that makes you question everything you thought you knew. Stay with me for the next few minutes, and I'll guide you through a journey unlike anything you've ever heard before. But I warn you, what you're about to hear is something so chilling, so eerie, that it might make you rethink everything you thought was possible. We're not just diving into a mystery here. We're uncovering something far more sinister, something that has been hiding in plain sight for over a decade. This is the story of a father's relentless search, of a family's unraveling, and of the terrifying secrets that the ocean held for so long. But before we dive deeper, let's rewind a little bit. Picture yourself there on that bright, sunny afternoon. The siblings, excited for their adventure, sail off into the horizon. It's the kind of day that promises freedom, joy, and endless possibilities. The town watches them go, and no one ever expects it to be the last time they see them. The siblings were experienced sailors. You see, Jack, the oldest, was 19, Lily, the middle child, was 16, and Ben, the youngest, just 12. They were no strangers to the sea. 4 years, they had gone out together, exploring the waters, looking for adventure. There was a deep bond between them, one that could never have been broken by anything, or so it seemed. But that day, the sea took something from them. Or, at least, that's what everyone assumed. The search teams scoured the waters for weeks, dragging the depths, looking for any trace of the siblings. They found nothing. Not a single clue. The boat, the one they had sailed off in, was found washed ashore a few days later, battered and broken, but there was no sign of the kids. Nothing. Over time, the hope of finding them alive faded. The case became a cold one. People forgot about the mystery. But the father, James, their dad, never gave up. For 12 long years, he searched. He questioned, investigated, and dug into every lead, no matter how small. He became obsessed, unable to accept that he would never see his children again. Then, one day, something strange happened. Something that no one, not even James, could have predicted. He stumbled across a series of old journals, scraps of paper that his children had kept during their travels. As he flipped through the pages, reading their words, his heart sank. These weren't just innocent notes of adventure, they were warnings, dark and cryptic messages. There was something far more dangerous out there than anyone had realized. And it wasn't just the sea that was to blame. The siblings had uncovered something terrifying that had been kept hidden for years. James didn't know it yet, but the path he was about to take would lead him to an answer so chilling, so shocking, that it would leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about his own children, the ocean, and the truth behind their disappearance. What could possibly have happened to them? Why were their journals filled with cryptic warnings? And what did the ocean hold that could have made them vanish without a trace? The truth was out there, but it was darker than anyone could imagine. So, here's the question. What was the real reason behind the disappearance of Jack, Lily, and Ben? And why did it take 12 long years for their father to uncover the truth? Stick with me, because we're about to dive deep into this mystery, and trust me, you won't believe what you're about to learn. In just a moment, you'll hear the full story. You'll walk step by step with James as he uncovers the chilling reason his children disappeared. I can promise you, by the end of this video, you'll be just as shocked as he was. Don't go anywhere, because we're only getting started. James had always been a man of routine. His life had been centered around his family, his business, and the quiet, peaceful town that had raised him. After his children vanished, his world turned into a series of empty, aching moments, each one dragging on like the slow ebb of the tide. The first few months after they disappeared were the hardest. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't focus. Every waking moment was consumed with the relentless thought, where are they? What happened to them? But the longer the search stretched on, the more hopeless it became. Eventually, the authorities stopped searching. There were no more volunteers, no more headlines in the local paper. The town had moved on. They had their own lives to live. But James couldn't let go. For 12 years, he clung to the belief that somehow, some way, his children were still out there. That's when his obsession began. He turned into a man who never stopped asking questions, never stopped digging. His every waking moment was consumed by the need for answers, and nothing else seemed to matter anymore. James began to isolate himself from the world. His wife, Sarah, couldn't take the weight of his obsession. She tried, at first, to help him move on, but as the years went by, she saw the toll it was taking on him. Their marriage slowly began to fall apart, and they drifted apart, like two ships lost at sea, each one struggling in its own direction. They stopped talking about their children. The pain was too much for Sarah to bear, and soon, she left. She needed to find peace for herself, and the home that was once full of laughter and love became nothing more than a hollow shell of memories. James, on the other hand, became more determined. The search for his children became his entire existence. He used his business trips as cover to explore new leads, investigate potential sightings, and speak with anyone who might know anything. But every lead, no matter how promising, always turned out to be a dead end. Each piece of new information would bring with it an initial spark of hope, only to crush it with the weight of disappointment. Yet, James never gave up. He couldn't. Then, just when he thought there was no more hope, he found something. It was a simple thing, an innocuous item at first, an old, weathered journal that had been tucked away in a second-hand bookstore on the outskirts of town. The owner had no idea where it had come from, but something about it felt different to James. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Lily's. As James flipped through the pages, a sickening chill ran down his spine. There were no ordinary entries here, no simple notes of the adventure his children had embarked upon. These pages were filled with cryptic symbols, odd phrases, and strange drawings that seemed to suggest something far darker. At first, it felt like a riddle, a puzzle that didn't make sense, but he knew, deep down, that it was a message. His children had been trying to tell him something in these pages, and he was finally seeing it for the first time. The entries began with seemingly harmless observations about the places they had visited on their journey, hidden coves, ancient ruins, and forgotten islands. But then the tone began to shift. The entries grew more erratic, more frantic. The further James read, the more disturbing the words became. There were mentions of something following them and eyes in the water. There were warnings about a strange island they had discovered, one that never appeared on any map, a place that no one should go. The deeper James dug into the journals, the more he began to feel like he was uncovering a secret his children had stumbled upon, something they weren't supposed to know, something they couldn't have possibly understood. And that's when it hit him. Could it be that his children hadn't simply vanished into the ocean? What if they had uncovered something dangerous, that no one was meant to find? James could feel it in his gut, the gnawing sense that there was something hidden here, something buried deep in the water that had claimed his children. He couldn't explain it, but he knew he was getting closer to the truth. He had to know more. But as he continued to follow the trail, he encountered strange resistance from people who had once known him well. The townspeople seemed uneasy when he mentioned the island, and some even went out of their way to discourage him from pursuing his investigation. People who were once friends now avoided him, as though they were hiding something. What was going on? Why were they so afraid to talk about the island? And why did it feel like everyone was conspiring to keep him from finding out the truth? Suspicion grew. There were whispers of old legends, strange occurrences, and tales of ships that had never returned. But it wasn't just the townspeople who seemed to have something to hide. James began to wonder if he was being followed, if someone or something was watching his every move. It was subtle at first, a shadow across the street, An unfamiliar car parked outside his house at odd hours, but the feeling never went away. Each step he took brought more questions than answers, and each answer seemed to lead to even more uncertainty. Then, there were the phone calls. They were always at night, always blocked numbers. The voice on the other end would say nothing at first, only heavy breathing, before the call would abruptly end. Sometimes, the voice sounded eerily familiar, like it belonged to someone he once knew. Other times, it was cold, distant, as though it had been distorted. Each call left James feeling more isolated, more paranoid. Was someone trying to warn him, or were they trying to keep him from finding the truth? James could feel the tension rising. The closer he got to uncovering what had happened to his children, the more dangerous it became. But he couldn't stop. He had to know. And now, with the discovery of the journals, the world he had once known, the quiet, peaceful life he had shared with his family, seemed like a distant memory. He had crossed into a new reality, one where the answers were buried deep, and the danger was far greater than he could have ever anticipated. What were his children really running from? And why did it feel like the truth was slipping through his fingers, no matter how hard he tried to grasp it? Each lead seemed to open more doors, but each door revealed only more questions. There were people who knew more than they were saying, but could he trust them? Or were they part of something much darker, a secret that had been kept for generations? James was no longer just a father looking for answers. He was a man on the edge, a man whose quest for truth had pulled him into a world he couldn't escape, a world where nothing was what it seemed, and the ocean held its secrets just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. And that's where you, the viewer, come in. Because what James is about to discover, the terrifying truth about what happened to his children, is something you're not going to believe. It's something that's been hidden from the world for far too long, and now, with each passing moment, he's getting closer to the dark, horrifying secret that will finally explain why his children disappeared all those years ago. James was beginning to piece together the puzzle, but the closer he got to the truth, the more obstacles seemed to appear. It was as if someone or something was actively trying to stop him from uncovering the dark history hidden beneath the surface. His investigation had taken on a life of its own, each lead pushing him further into a world that felt less and less like his own. The journals had given him a glimmer of hope, a sense that he was finally on the right track, but that hope began to dim as things started to go wrong. One evening, as James went through the journals again, trying to decipher the last few cryptic entries, something strange happened. The pages began to feel different. One of the most important journals, the one he'd found hidden in the back of the bookstore, was missing. He checked the entire house, retracing his steps, searching every corner. But it was gone. As if it had never been there at all. Panic settled into his chest as he realized the implications of what had just happened. That journal held the final pieces of the puzzle. The key to everything. But now it was gone, and there was no trace of it. Had someone taken it? Had someone been in his home while he slept? The thought made his skin crawl. Desperate, he tried to retrace his steps. He contacted the bookstore owner again, but she had no idea who had purchased the journal. James felt the walls closing in around him. Whoever had the journal was ahead of him now, and they didn't want him to get any closer to the truth. Every door seemed to be closing faster than he could open them. Then, things took an even darker turn. James received an unexpected visit from someone he hadn't seen in years, Detective Harris, the officer who had been assigned to the case when his children first went missing. The detective had always been the one who seemed the most sympathetic, the one who tried to reassure James in the early days that they would do everything they could to find the kids. But over time, the case had gone cold, and Harris had moved on. The fact that he was showing up now, after all these years, was unsettling. He claimed to be doing a routine follow-up, but James could see the tension in his eyes. It didn't feel like routine. Harris seemed nervous, almost like he was trying to convince himself that he wasn't involved in something far deeper than he cared to acknowledge. "I wouldn't go digging too much, James," Harris said, his voice low, his gaze darting around as if someone might be listening. "Sometimes, some things are better left buried, you know? People don't always want the past to come up again." James froze, feeling a wave of suspicion flood over him. What was Harris really saying? Was the detective trying to warn him off? Or was he trying to hide something? The words were subtle, But the tone wasn't. There was something sinister in the way Harris spoke, like he was pleading with James to stop, to let the past stay forgotten. But James wasn't one to back down, not now, not after everything he had uncovered. He pressed the detective, asking him directly if he knew anything about the island, about the strange occurrences in the journals. But Harris was evasive. He danced around the questions, his unease growing by the second. It was clear he didn't want to talk about it. But James could see the signs, the shift in Harris' demeanor, the way he became increasingly defensive. Something was wrong, and James could feel it. That night, after Harris left, James couldn't shake the feeling that the detective knew more than he was letting on. He needed to dig deeper, but there were too many loose threads. The trail was growing colder, and every time he thought he was close to the truth, something new threw him off course. The next day, James received a phone call, an anonymous tip. The voice on the other end was muffled, but he could still make out a few words. "The island, don't go there." Then the line went dead. The call wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. Whoever had called was terrified, and they clearly didn't want him digging into the past. But why? What was so dangerous about the island that no one would talk about it? What had his children discovered that had led to their disappearance? In a moment of frustration, James decided to confront the people who might know something. He made his way to the local library, a place he'd never thought of as important to his investigation. There, he spoke to Eleanor, a woman who had worked at the library for years. She had always been quiet, a bit of a recluse, but James knew she had been around when his children were still young. She had seen them grow up, seen their curiosity about the sea. But when he asked her about the island, her reaction was anything but normal. Her face drained of color, and she immediately looked around, as though checking to see if anyone else was listening. She motioned for James to follow her into a back room, away from prying eyes. "I don't know what you're looking for," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling, "but I've seen things I can't explain. People have come here looking for that island, looking for answers, but no one ever comes back the same." She hesitated, her hand clutching the edge of the table as though afraid to let go. "James, I don't know if you should be messing with this. There are things that..." Before she could finish, the door to the back room slammed open, and a figure stepped inside, Detective Harris. He wasn't looking at James. He was staring directly at Eleanor, his eyes cold, calculating. "Is there a problem here?" Harris asked, his voice dark and steady. Eleanor's face turned pale, and James could feel the tension in the air. What was happening? Why had Harris followed him to the library? Was he trying to intimidate Eleanor into silence? Or was it something even darker? Was he involved in the disappearance of his children all those years ago? The question hung in the air like a shadow, and for the first time, James wasn't sure who to trust. Was Harris trying to protect something, or was he trying to keep something buried? Eleanor seemed terrified, and James felt like he was only one step away from uncovering something huge. But the pieces were slipping out of his grasp. Just when he thought he was on the verge of the truth, he found himself lost in a web of lies, deception, and fear. James' world was collapsing in on itself, and he didn't know who was on his side anymore. Was he just a father desperately chasing ghosts, or was there something much deeper at play? And what had his children uncovered all those years ago? What secret were they really running from? The answers were out there, but they were becoming harder and harder to reach, and the closer James got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. Now, with the walls closing in and trust slipping away, James was faced with an impossible choice: keep pushing forward into the unknown, or turn back before it was too late. What would he do next? As the days wore on, James couldn't shake the feeling that the walls around him were closing in faster than he could process. Detective Harris's chilling visit, the mysterious phone call, and now Eleanor's cryptic warnings, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle he wasn't meant to solve, but something far more sinister was afoot. And just when he thought he might find a way through the labyrinth of half-truths, another twist came that changed everything. It was a late night when the second bombshell dropped, and it came from a place James least expected: Sarah, his ex-wife. After years of silence, she reached out to him, and her message was as cryptic as it was urgent. "James, we need to talk. Meet me at the old dock." The old dock was a place from their past, a place they'd shared memories of their children, a place James hadn't visited in years. The fact that Sarah was even reaching out felt strange. Their relationship had fractured when the search for the kids turned into an obsession, and after she left, they'd barely spoken. Yet, something in her message felt too urgent, too desperate to ignore. When he arrived at the dock, the air was thick with mist, and the sound of the waves crashing against the wood sent a chill down his spine. Sarah stood there, her face as worn as his, her eyes hollow with years of unresolved grief. She didn't say anything at first, just looked out across the water, the silence between them stretching on, heavy and uncomfortable. Finally, she turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been hearing things, James. Strange things. And I think it's time you knew the truth about what happened that day." James felt his heart race, the weight of her words crashing into him like a tidal wave. "What are you talking about?" he asked, but he already had a sinking feeling in his gut. The truth, what was it? And why hadn't she told him all this time? She hesitated before speaking again, her gaze shifting uneasily. "There's something you don't know. Something that was kept from both of us. When the kids left, I did some digging of my own. Not right away, but after a while, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong. A friend of mine, someone from my past, they told me something, James. Something I didn't want to believe. They said that your children didn't just disappear by accident." She paused, her face pale. "They were taken. Taken by someone who didn't want them found." The words hung in the air, impossible to grasp. Taken? But by who? And why? "Sarah, what are you talking about?" James asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and desperation. "You can't be serious. I've been chasing down every lead, every clue for 12 years. You think someone took them on purpose?" Sarah's hands shook as she clutched the sides of her jacket. "James, I didn't want to believe it either, but after everything that's happened, I know now. The person who took them, they're still out there. And they've been watching us this whole time." The chilling realization hit James like a slap to the face. Someone had been watching him. Someone who knew far more than they were letting on. The journal, Eleanor's warnings, Harris's cryptic words, everything was starting to connect, but the more he uncovered, the deeper the hole seemed to get. Before he could ask more questions, Sarah handed him a small envelope, worn at the edges, as though it had been handled multiple times. "I found this at the back of an old storage locker in town, James. It was buried under a pile of forgotten papers. When I saw it, I knew you needed to have it." She looked at him, her eyes filled with something between fear and regret. "I don't know who left it there, but it's a warning. I think it's from the same person who took the kids." James took the envelope from her, feeling the weight of it in his hands. He opened it slowly, as though fearing what he might find inside. But what he saw stunned him. It was a photograph, a grainy, black and white image of the 3 children, Jack, Lily, and Ben, standing together on the deck of a boat. But there was something off about the photo. They looked different, older than they had been when they set sail all those years ago. The background showed a dark, foggy landscape, an island. The same island the journals had mentioned, the one his children had warned about. But the real shock came when he noticed something in the corner of the picture. A figure. Tall, cloaked in shadow, standing at the edge of the boat, watching them. It was hard to make out any details, but the figure's presence sent an unsettling chill through James's spine. "Who is that?" he whispered, his voice shaking. "Who is that person?" Sarah didn't answer right away. She just stared at the photo, her face grim. "That's the person who took them, James. I don't know who they are, but I've seen them before." She paused, her eyes darting nervously. "I think they've been watching you, watching me, for years." Before James could react, the distant sound of footsteps echoed behind him. He spun around, but the dock was empty. The feeling of being watched crept up on him once again, more intense than ever before. Someone had been following him, someone knew about the photo, and they knew about his investigation. They were always one step ahead, and now, it felt like the noose was tightening. With his mind racing, James turned back to Sarah. "Do you have any idea who this person is? Where they came from? Why they're doing this?" Sarah shook her head, her face pale with fear. "I don't know, James. But I have a feeling they're not just after the kids. They're after you, too. As the words left her lips, the weight of it all settled on James's shoulders. For 12 years, he had believed he was looking for answers, trying to find the children who had vanished. But what if it wasn't just about them? What if the entire town, his entire life, had been built on a lie? And who could he trust in this unraveling world? The atmosphere was growing thicker, more oppressive. Each step he took seemed to bring him closer to a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to face. The island, the shadowy figure, the warnings, everything was leading him to one inevitable conclusion. But what was the secret they were all hiding? And why had they let him get this far into it? As he stood there, holding the photo, something in the distance caught his eye, a flicker of movement near the edge of the dock. He wasn't alone anymore. Someone had been watching him this entire time. The question wasn't just who had taken his children. It was who was controlling the story and what they were willing to do to keep him from knowing the truth. James didn't know how much longer he could keep pushing forward, but one thing was clear, there was no turning back now. James couldn't shake the feeling that he was running out of time. The photo, the warning, the unsettling presence of someone always lurking just beyond his awareness, it all began to weigh on him, suffocating him with the dread of what was still to come. The more he tried to make sense of it, the more he realized that everything he thought he knew was slipping through his fingers like sand. Every lead he followed seemed to bring him closer to an answer, but also deeper into a web of lies and danger that he hadn't fully understood until now. And now, standing there on the dock with Sarah, a chilling realization settled in. He wasn't just searching for his children anymore, he was searching for a dangerous truth, and it was coming for him, too. The photo had rattled him, yes, but it was the feeling that lingered in his gut, the constant sense that he was being watched, that gnawed at him every minute. He couldn't stop glancing over his shoulder, couldn't stop checking the rearview mirror when he drove, couldn't shake the thought that someone, somewhere, was always right behind him, waiting for him to make a mistake. It was a quiet, pervasive paranoia that kept him up at night, his mind racing through the possibilities. But it wasn't until the next day that everything took a darker turn. It started with a phone call, one that James almost didn't answer, thinking it was just another anonymous threat or warning. But the voice on the other end of the line made his blood run cold. "You should have stopped digging, James. It's too late now. You're never going to find what you're looking for." The voice was muffled, distorted, but the words were clear enough to make James's heart skip a beat. This wasn't just some random threat. This was personal. He slammed the phone down, his hand shaking. He had been getting these calls for weeks now, always blocked numbers, always late at night. But this time felt different. There was an urgency to the voice, a sense of finality that sent a deep chill down his spine. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Whoever was behind these calls knew too much. They knew his every move. And worse, they weren't just trying to intimidate him, they were trying to scare him into stopping. But James wasn't the type to back down. Not now, not when he was so close to the truth. That afternoon, he went to check his house, something in his gut telling him something wasn't right. The place had always felt like a safe haven, but today, the silence felt oppressive. He walked through the rooms, eyes scanning for anything unusual, but everything seemed just as it should be. Yet, something felt off. The air was thick with tension, and he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that someone had been inside. As he made his way into the living room, his gaze fell on the window. It was slightly ajar, just enough to let in a breeze. James froze. He hadn't left the window open. He was sure of it. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as he stepped closer, his mind racing through the possibilities. Had someone been inside his house? Had they left a clue, or worse, taken something? He rushed to his desk, his heart pounding as he rifled through papers, notes, and old files related to the case. Everything was in disarray, as though someone had gone through it all, looking for something. He could feel the sweat bead on his forehead as he scanned the room, the walls closing in on him. But it wasn't until he turned to leave that he noticed the photo, the one he'd found with Sarah just the night before, was gone. The air felt suffocating as panic clawed at his chest. Who had taken it? Who could have been in his house? The realization hit him like a truck. He wasn't just being watched anymore, he was being hunted. This wasn't just about finding the kids anymore. It was about something bigger, something darker, and now it was coming for him. He left his house in a hurry, heading for the library again, desperate for answers. But the city, once familiar, now felt like a maze of shadows. Every corner he turned seemed to hide another threat, every street a potential trap. The library was just as he remembered it, quiet, the musty smell of old books hanging in the air, but when he reached the back room, where Eleanor had warned him about the island, the door was locked. Eleanor had never locked the door. James knocked, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time, frustration and fear mixing in his chest. Still nothing. Then he tried the handle. To his surprise, it turned, and the door creaked open. Inside, the room was empty. The light was dim, and the shelves of books cast long shadows across the walls. But it wasn't the emptiness that made James's stomach turn, it was what he found on the desk. A piece of paper, folded neatly. It was a note, scrawled in hurried handwriting. "You're not safe, James. Leave now." There was no signature, no clue as to who it was from. But the message was clear, someone was trying to send a warning, and it was far too late to turn back. As James stood there, holding the note, a sound made him spin around, footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. He wasn't alone. His heart leaped into his throat as he froze, straining his ears to listen. The footsteps were coming closer. Someone was in the library, moving toward him, but when James turned to face them, there was no one there. Just the shadows. And that's when the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening crash. He bolted for the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through him as he yanked at the handle, his heart racing. He was trapped. Then, a voice broke the silence, low, calm, and chillingly familiar. "You shouldn't have come here, James," said the voice, and it sent a shock of ice through his veins. It was Harris. But this wasn't the detective James remembered. The warmth was gone from his voice, replaced by something darker, something more sinister. "This is bigger than you. Bigger than your kids. You don't understand what you're dealing with." James's blood ran cold. He was face to face with the man who had been the first to promise him answers, who had once seemed so sympathetic to his cause. Now, Harris looked like a man possessed, his eyes hard and cold, the remnants of any empathy long gone. "What do you mean?" James demanded, struggling to keep his voice steady. "What's happening? What is this?" Harris stepped closer, his shadow swallowing the room. "You were never meant to find the truth, James. And now that you have, it's too late. There are people who will do anything to keep the secrets buried, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to stop you." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. Was this really happening? Was Harris involved in this all along? Had he been hiding in plain sight? James had no way of knowing for sure, but the sense of urgency, the weight of everything he had uncovered, was starting to feel like a noose tightening around his neck. And just when he thought things couldn't get worse, the lights flickered, casting long, ominous shadows across the room. In the distance, he heard a sound, a door opening, footsteps approaching, too many people. Too many eyes. His blood ran cold, and he realized, with a sickening certainty, that the truth was slipping further away from him with every passing second. He had thought he was getting closer. But now, he wasn't just being hunted for answers, he was being hunted for a reason that was far darker and more dangerous than he had ever imagined. And he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep running before the truth consumed him whole. The tension in the room was suffocating, and for the first time in 12 years, James found himself truly scared not just of the dangers closing in on him, but of the reality that was shifting beneath his feet. Harris's words were like a dark omen, echoing through his mind. "You were never meant to find the truth." The phrase kept replaying, each time carrying more weight than before. What truth was he talking about? What was it that had remained hidden for all these years? He thought back to everything he had discovered, the journals, the cryptic warnings, the shadowy figure in the photograph. It had all felt like a tangled mess of clues pointing toward one undeniable conclusion. Someone was out there, pulling the strings, keeping his children from him. But now, as Harris's cold eyes fixed on him, the puzzle seemed to be shifting in a way that James couldn't quite grasp. "You really don't know, do you?" Harris's voice was almost pitying now, and James's pulse quickened. There was a finality in the detective's tone, as though the truth was something so dark, so unspeakable, that even Harris didn't want to say it aloud. "No, what?" James's voice was strained, the desperation in his chest making the words come out sharp. "What truth? You've been in this with me for years, Harris. You said you wanted to find them. You promised." The detective's lips curled into something between a sneer and a grimace. "Promises are for children, James. And you've been chasing ghosts all this time. The truth, well, the truth isn't what you think. It's never been about your kids." For a moment, James stood frozen, his mind spinning. What was Harris talking about? How could it not be about the children? He'd spent 12 years consumed by the search, and the only thing that had ever kept him going was the hope of bringing them home. It was the reason he'd alienated everyone around him, the reason he'd sacrificed his career, his marriage, his sanity. But now, it was like the foundation of everything he thought he knew was crumbling beneath him. Before James could respond, there was a sudden noise behind him. The door slammed open with a force that made James jump. He turned, ready for more threats, ready for whoever was waiting to confront him next. But the person who stepped into the room was someone he never expected. It was Eleanor. Her eyes were wide, her face pale with fear, but there was something different in her demeanor now, something unsettling. She wasn't the woman who had so earnestly helped him dig through the town's history. The woman who had shared old town records and whispered warnings in the dark corners of the library. No, this version of Eleanor was shaken, as though something had broken her resolve. "James," she said, her voice shaky, "I need to tell you something, something that I should have told you a long time ago." James felt a pit open up in his stomach, his hands instinctively gripping the edge of the desk. "What is it, Eleanor? What's going on?" Eleanor hesitated, looking at Harris first, then back to James. She took a step forward, her gaze shifting nervously, before lowering her voice. "You've been looking in the wrong places all this time. The kids, the disappearance, it was all part of something much bigger than you can imagine." Harris scoffed, stepping away from James, his eyes narrowing as if he were watching a game unfold. "Go on, Eleanor. Tell him." Eleanor swallowed hard, her hands trembling. It wasn't just about the children. It was about the island. It was always about the island, and it's connected to something that goes back decades, something that your father, James, knew about. The whole town knew, but they kept it quiet. The disappearances were planned. James's heart pounded in his chest. "What do you mean, planned?" His voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking any louder would shatter the fragile thread of understanding he was clinging to. Eleanor glanced toward the window, her eyes darting nervously as though something or someone was watching them. "Your father was involved. He didn't just lose his children, James. He made a choice. A terrible one. And he paid for it. But the rest of us, we didn't have a choice." James's breath caught in his throat. Everything inside him seemed to freeze, his pulse hammering in his ears. He was hearing things, wasn't he? His father had been involved. The man who had raised him, the man who had always been the rock in his life, had chosen to let his children disappear. "No," James said, his voice shaking with disbelief. "No, that's not possible. My father, he would never." "He would," Eleanor interrupted softly, her eyes full of guilt. "It was his doing, James. He was part of the group that orchestrated the whole thing. They were trying to keep something hidden, something so dangerous that they needed the children to disappear. You've been looking at it all wrong. The children weren't just victims in this. They were the key to something far worse. Something the town tried to bury." James felt the ground beneath him shift, his world spinning with confusion. His father. A part of this conspiracy? The idea was so preposterous that he couldn't wrap his mind around it. But Eleanor's eyes, those wide, frightened eyes, told him that she wasn't lying. That this wasn't some twisted game. And Harris's silence only confirmed it. There was a truth here, one that was darker and deeper than anything he'd ever imagined. As his thoughts raced, trying to piece together the impossible truth, Eleanor took a step closer to him, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You need to stop, James. You need to leave now before it's too late. You're playing into their hands. They're already watching you. They know you're close to finding out everything, and they won't let that happen. James took a step back, his mind overwhelmed by the flood of information. His father was somehow involved in this. The whole town was complicit in hiding whatever had really happened on that island. The children had been taken because of something far more sinister than he had ever thought possible. He turned to Harris, his voice rising in anger and confusion. "Why didn't you tell me, Harris? All these years, why didn't you say anything?" Harris met his gaze with an almost amused look. "Because some truths are too dangerous to share, James. Your father knew that. And now, so do you." The weight of the revelation crashed over James, and for the first time in 12 years, he felt the crushing weight of the mystery he'd been chasing. But now, it wasn't just a matter of finding his children, it was about uncovering a conspiracy that reached deeper than he could have ever imagined. And the more he uncovered, the more the line between ally and enemy blurred. As the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, James's world didn't just shatter, it dissolved entirely. He wasn't just up against a missing persons case anymore. He was up against a force far more powerful, and now he understood the truth wasn't just dangerous. It was deadly. James stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest as the weight of the truth began to settle in. Every breath he took felt heavier than the last, every thought clouded by the dizzying realization that the story he had been chasing for so long had never been what he thought it was. His father, the man he had trusted with his entire life, had been part of this tangled web of deception and conspiracy. The children weren't just victims, they were pieces in a much larger game. And now, he had no idea who he could trust anymore, no idea who was on his side or whether anyone ever truly had been. The world he once knew had vanished, replaced by something darker, more dangerous, and far too complex for him to understand in the moment. Eleanor's warning still echoed in his mind, "You need to stop, James. You need to leave now before it's too late. They're watching you. They know you're close to finding out everything." He could feel the pressure tightening around him, the weight of the decisions ahead threatening to suffocate him. If he kept going, he would risk everything, his life, his family, everything he had ever believed in. But if he stopped now, if he let this go, then he would be letting the people who were behind all of this get away with it. He couldn't do that. Not after all these years of searching. Not after the years of pain, of emptiness, of longing. But there was a choice in front of him now, one he hadn't anticipated. Harris's words echoed in his mind, as cold and final as they had been in the library. Some truths are too dangerous to share. Was he truly ready to face the consequences of knowing the full story? Was it worth the risk of losing everything, of losing himself in the process? Or would he walk away, leave the truth buried, and attempt to rebuild a life that had already been destroyed by the pursuit of it? The sound of footsteps behind him broke his reverie, and James whipped around to see Sarah, standing in the doorway with a look on her face that was a mix of fear and determination. Her eyes were wide, her lips trembling as she took a step into the room. She hadn't been there when the revelations had come pouring out, when Harris and Eleanor had laid everything bare in front of him. But now, she was here, and the look in her eyes made his stomach churn. She knew something. She had to. She always had a way of seeing things that others didn't, of understanding things before they became clear to anyone else. "James," she said softly, but the sharpness in her voice betrayed the gravity of what she was about to say. "You can't keep doing this." He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing, trying to make sense of the words that were tumbling from her lips. "What do you mean, Sarah? What are you talking about?" "I've known about this for longer than you think," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper now, her eyes darting nervously toward the door. "I've been a part of it, James. A small part, but it's enough. I didn't want you to get tangled in this. I thought it was behind me, but now," she trailed off, shaking her head as if to dispel the thoughts swirling inside her mind. James took a step toward her, his mind spinning in confusion. "Sarah, what the hell are you talking about? What part of it? What did you know?" "I didn't know everything. Not at first. But I found out. About your father, about the island, about what really happened to the kids. And I tried to bury it, James. I tried to walk away. But now, I see you in the middle of it, and I can't pretend it's not real anymore. This thing, whatever it is, it's bigger than both of us. And if you don't stop now, if you keep digging, it's going to destroy you. Her voice cracked at the last word, and she dropped her gaze to the floor. James's mind was racing, every thought fighting for dominance as he tried to comprehend what Sarah was telling him. She had known all this time. She had been a part of it. It was impossible to believe, yet her face, her eyes, the desperation in her voice, it was all too real. The woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted above all else, was now standing in front of him, admitting that she had been complicit in whatever dark forces were at play. "Why didn't you tell me, Sarah?" His voice was thick with emotion, a mix of anger, betrayal, and confusion. "Why didn't you warn me?" "I couldn't, James," she whispered, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I thought you were better off not knowing. I thought if you kept looking, if you kept searching, you'd just fall into their hands. But now I see that it's already too late for us. It's too late for all of us." James felt his chest tighten as the truth crashed over him. He had always believed that the people closest to him, Eleanor, Harris, even Sarah, were helping him, guiding him toward the answers. But now, the realization hit him like a freight train. They had all been playing their parts in this twisted, dangerous game. And now, he was trapped in it, unable to escape. The people he had trusted were not his allies, they were part of the problem, complicit in the same conspiracy that had taken everything from him. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, a terrible silence that only made the tension more unbearable. James's thoughts spun out of control, but one thing became clear: he couldn't trust anyone anymore. He was alone in this fight. And the choice in front of him was impossible. He could walk away, leave the search for the truth behind, let the people who were behind all of this get away with it. He could protect Sarah, protect himself, and try to find a way to rebuild the shattered pieces of his life. But in doing so, he would be abandoning the very thing that had kept him going all these years, the need to understand, to know the truth, no matter the cost. Or, he could keep pushing forward, despite the threats, despite the betrayal, despite the overwhelming odds against him. He could risk everything, the life he'd built, the people he still loved, even his own sanity, just to uncover what had really happened to his children, to uncover what dark forces were pulling the strings behind the veil of secrecy. The problem was, in this moment, James didn't know which choice would cost him more, walking away from the truth, or walking deeper into the abyss. Either way, he felt as if he was standing at the edge of a precipice, and the only thing he could be sure of was that the ground beneath him was crumbling away faster than he could keep up with. "James," Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts, but her tone was different now, pleading, desperate. "Please. I'm begging you, don't go any further. I can't lose you to this." The words hung in the air between them, a final plea for him to choose safety over truth. But James's heart was already made up. He could feel it deep within him, the truth was out there, and no matter the cost, he would find it. Even if it meant losing everything. Even if it meant losing her. "I have to go, Sarah," he said softly, but the resolve in his voice was clear. "I have to know what happened. I can't stop now. You have to stop. They'll kill you if you don't. They won't stop until they've gotten what they want." As he turned to leave, the weight of his decision settled over him. It wasn't just about the truth anymore, it was about survival. And now, James understood. The hardest choices were never between right and wrong, but between the things you loved most and the things you needed to know. James's breath came in shallow gasps as he stepped out of the room, his heart pounding with a rhythm that felt too fast, too chaotic to be his own. Every part of him screamed for answers, for clarity, but as the door slammed shut behind him, the weight of the decision he had just made sank deep into his bones. He had chosen to keep going. He had chosen the truth, no matter the cost. But what he hadn't anticipated, what he hadn't understood until now, was just how far the conspiracy went. He had been too focused on the people around him, on the ones he thought he could trust, that he had failed to see the bigger picture. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about his children, about Sarah, or Eleanor, or Harris. It was something much bigger, something so vast, so far-reaching, that James couldn't even begin to comprehend the full scale of it. The streets outside the building were empty, the night air thick and oppressive. The world around him felt suffocating, as if every shadow held a secret, every rustle in the wind was a warning. He could feel the weight of eyes on him, like he was being watched from every direction, even though there was no one in sight. He started walking, his pace quickening as his mind spun with the revelations that had been thrust upon him. The truth had already begun to unravel in unexpected ways. Eleanor, Sarah, even Harris, all of them had been playing roles in a much larger game. But the deeper he went, the more he realized that the strings of this conspiracy were connected to far more people than he could have ever imagined. The phone in his pocket buzzed, its sudden vibration cutting through the tension in the air. His heart skipped a beat as he pulled it out, expecting to see a message from someone he trusted. But what he saw instead made his blood run cold. It was a message from an unknown number, just a short sentence that sent a chill down his spine. "You're too late, James. They're already here." Before he could even process it, the streetlights flickered, and for a split second, everything went dark. The air around him shifted, growing colder, heavier. The feeling of being watched intensified, like something or someone was closing in. Panic surged through him as he pulled the phone to his ear, dialing Sarah's number with trembling hands. But there was no answer. No voice on the other end of the line. Just static. His grip tightened on the phone as his mind raced. What had she meant by "they'll come for you"? Who were they? A car sped past him, its headlights blinding for a moment before disappearing into the distance. It wasn't the speed that caught James's attention, but the figure sitting in the back seat. A man he recognized all too well. It was one of the people he had believed to be on his side, someone who had worked with him, someone who had helped him investigate his children's disappearance. Max. Max was supposed to be his ally, someone who had offered him information when no one else would. But now, seeing him in that car, with that cold, calculating look on his face as he stared straight ahead, James felt the knot in his stomach tighten. Max wasn't part of this game. He was the game. The car vanished into the night, and the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Max had been lying to him all along. He had been orchestrating things from the shadows, pulling the strings while James had been chasing after false leads. James's instincts had been right all along. There had been something off about Max, something he couldn't quite place. But now, with that one look, with that one undeniable truth, it was clear. Max was in on it. And whatever it was much, much worse than James had ever imagined. He turned on his heel, the adrenaline now pumping through his veins as his thoughts scrambled to catch up. He had to find Maximum. He had to confront him, find out just how deep the rabbit hole went, and make him spill whatever he knew about the conspiracy. But before he could take another step, the familiar, guttural hum of an engine revved behind him. He spun around, his eyes locking onto the dark silhouette of a van pulling into the alley just ahead. The door slid open, revealing a figure James instantly recognized. It was Harris. His heart dropped as Harris stepped out, a grim expression on his face as he looked directly at James. The world around him felt as if it had frozen, the air thick with tension and unspoken truths. Harris wasn't just a detective trying to help him. He had been a part of the conspiracy from the beginning, a player in this twisted game who had been manipulating James from the shadows. "James," Harris said in a voice that sent a shiver down his spine. "You should have listened. You should have stopped when you had the chance." James didn't know what to say. His mind was racing, trying to piece together the shards of truth that were scattering around him like broken glass. Every person he had trusted, every lead he had followed, had been a lie. Max, Harris, Eleanor, Sarah, all of them had been playing a part in this dark, complex web of deception. But the questions kept growing. Why? What was their endgame? Before he could speak, Harris took a step closer, his voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "You don't get it, do you? It was never about the children. It was about power. Control. And now that you're in the middle of it, you're a threat. You're a liability." James's pulse raced as his thoughts collided with a terrifying realization. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about his family. This was about something far larger, something much more insidious than he could ever have understood. He had been a pawn in someone else's game from the very beginning, and now, they were playing for keeps. In that moment, everything changed. The weight of the conspiracy, the scope of it, crashed down on him all at once. This was bigger than a few people working behind the scenes. This was an entire network, a shadow organization that had infiltrated every part of his life, every person he had ever known. And now, James was caught in the eye of the storm, helpless to stop it. As Harris moved closer, a chill ran down James's spine. The detective wasn't alone. There were others, figures stepping out of the van, their faces masked, their eyes glinting with malice. They were closing in, and James knew that he had mere seconds to decide whether to fight or to flee. His options were running out, his body was trembling with the cold realization that he was completely outmatched, and yet the only thing that drove him forward was the thought of his children. He couldn't let this end like this. Not after everything. But just as Harris took another step, the sound of an explosion rattled the air, and the ground beneath James's feet shook. The world around him spun into chaos as the van behind him erupted in a ball of flame, and in the blink of an eye, everything he thought he understood about this twisted conspiracy was shattered. The blast sent him flying forward, slamming into the pavement as the world turned to fire and dust. The last thing he heard, before everything went black, was Harris's voice, faint, distant, as if from another world. "You've only just begun to understand, James. Welcome to the endgame." And with that, the world went silent. James's head throbbed as he staggered to his feet, his vision spinning, the smoke from the explosion still curling in the air around him like some kind of toxic veil. His ears rang, and for a moment, the world seemed to stretch and warp around him, as if time itself had slowed. His clothes were singed, his body aching, but he barely registered the pain. All he could focus on was the chaos, the sound of footsteps running, the crackle of burning metal, the distant wail of sirens growing louder. Every instinct told him to move, to run, but his mind was stuck, replaying the horrifying words Harris had just said to him before the blast. "You've only just begun to understand, James. Welcome to the endgame." The endgame. It was a term he had heard so many times now, a phrase that seemed to linger in his mind like a shadow. But what did it mean? And how had he gotten to this point? He had been chasing after the truth, believing that he could solve the mystery of his children's disappearance, believing that there was a purpose, a plan behind it all. But now, the lines had blurred, and the pieces of the puzzle weren't just scattered, they were shattered beyond recognition. He wasn't just caught in a conspiracy about the children anymore. He was trapped in a larger, darker game, and the rules had never been what he thought they were. He glanced around, his heart pounding, trying to get his bearings. The van was gone, reduced to rubble, but Harris and the others, Max, Sarah, Eleanor, all of them were still out there. They hadn't just vanished into the night. They were playing a part in something bigger, something insidious. And no matter how hard he tried to convince himself otherwise, he knew one painful truth: they had been lying to him from the start. As he staggered forward, he could see figures moving in the smoke, silhouettes, indistinct but definitely there. His fingers trembled as he gripped the gun he had taken from one of the men earlier, the weight of it unfamiliar, almost absurd in his hands. It wasn't the weapon he had needed in this fight, it was the answers. And he was getting closer. He could feel it in his bones, feel the truth pulling at him, taunting him, just out of reach. Then he heard it. A voice, soft but unmistakable. A voice he thought he had left behind in the chaos of the past few days. James. James's world felt like it was collapsing around him, the walls of lies and betrayal closing in with each passing second. The figures surrounding him, the cold faces of people he had once trusted, Max, his father, Harris, they all seemed to blur into a single, terrifying entity. He could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him, the crushing realization that his entire life had been manipulated, that every choice he'd made had been a calculated step in their game. But in that moment, as he stood there, surrounded by shadows and lies, something inside him shifted. There was no more fear. There was no more panic. There was only the need to fight. To reclaim whatever was left of the truth, whatever pieces of his life he could still salvage. He couldn't let them win. Not like this. His father took another step forward, his cold eyes locking onto James's with a finality that made James's blood run cold. "You never understood, did you?" his father said, his voice quiet now, almost gentle. "This isn't just about control. It's about survival. We've done what we had to do, James. You've been too blinded by your quest for answers to see it." James opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. He couldn't speak, couldn't find the right thing to say. What could he say to the man who had disappeared from his life 12 years ago, who had never once shown any remorse for leaving him behind, who had let him wander through a maze of lies and half-truths? And now, standing there, everything came into focus. His father had never been the person he thought he was. He had been a part of something far darker, something that had shaped their entire family, shaping James into the man he had become. But the pieces of the puzzle were finally clicking together. It wasn't over yet. Not for James. Not for his children. His mind raced as he made a split-second decision. He had come so far, and he wasn't going to let this be the end of his story. Not like this. He took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. In the brief silence that followed, he lunged forward, his hand reaching into his pocket, where he still had the small device, a tracker, he had found earlier. It was small, unassuming, but it was the last piece of his plan. With one fluid motion, he activated it, sending a signal out into the night. His pulse quickened as he heard the familiar hum of a helicopter above, the sound growing louder, echoing through the empty streets. They weren't expecting it. They never had. His father's eyes widened with realization, but it was too late. The game had changed. The helicopter, the one he'd secretly arranged for, was his ticket out. Not just for him, but for his children, for the truth. It was their last chance to stop the conspiracy, to expose the dark network that had been pulling strings in the shadows for so long. The betrayal, the lies, they were all coming to light. And James was finally in control. He wasn't the pawn anymore. He was the one pulling the strings. For a fleeting moment, James thought about what his life could have been if things had gone differently. If his father had never disappeared, if they had never been involved in this dark, dangerous world. He thought about the family that could have been, about the children who would have grown up without the shadow of deceit hanging over them. But he didn't have time for that. He didn't have time for regrets. The moment for change was now. As the helicopter touched down, the figures around him scattered, confusion and panic spreading like wildfire. His father stood still, watching him, his face a mixture of disbelief and anger. "You think you've won?" he asked, his voice laced with venom. "This isn't the end, James. You're walking into a storm that you'll never be able to survive." James didn't respond. He didn't need to. His actions spoke louder than any words could. He stepped into the helicopter, his heart racing as the blades whirred to life, lifting him away from the chaos. As the ground fell away beneath him, he looked out over the city, the sprawling landscape that had been his life. His mind drifted to his children, to the unanswered questions, to the truth he had fought so hard to uncover. The world was still filled with shadows, still filled with uncertainty. But for the first time in years, James felt a sliver of hope. The truth was out there, and he was finally going to find it. The helicopter soared higher into the night sky, the city lights twinkling like distant stars below. And in that quiet moment, James realized that while the conspiracy might not be over, the journey he had started had been worth it. He had fought not just for himself, but for his family. For the people he loved, for the children he had lost, for the truth that had been buried beneath layers of lies and deceit. He had come so far, and though he couldn't see the end just yet, he knew he was closer than ever. The storm was far from over, but he was ready for whatever came next. As the helicopter ascended into the darkness, one question remained unanswered in the back of his mind: was he truly free? The answer was still uncertain, hanging in the air like the fading echo of a distant, unresolved mystery. But James didn't mind. The journey was his, and that was enough for now. As the lights of the city faded into the distance, one thing was clear: this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, the game was still being played. The screen faded to black, leaving only the lingering sound of the helicopter's engine, and in the stillness, a single question echoed, one that would stay with the audience long after the credits rolled: who's really in control?